Hello and welcome to our first session of the BRICS Business Council roundtable on accelerating a sustainable and inclusive COVID-19 recovery. For some of us who are based here in South Africa, I'll say good afternoon. And I know it might be a different time for some members who are joining us this afternoon. So as you will know, the Financial Services Working Group of the South African chapter of the BRICS Business Council is hosting a series of 3 virtual 90-minute roundtable discussions throughout the month of May. And this right here is our first one. And on this first one, we are unpacking a topic around building an inclusive and resilient economy. And we've got a fabulous panel to unpack the topic with us. But before I introduce the panel, let me introduce myself. My name is Manda Chiflaro. I'm a director and CEO at Superlead Advisory, which is a consulting, facilitation, and a coaching consultancy firm. And you will see on the screen our panelists. I will introduce each at a time as we unpack the conversation. And I must just note that these sessions are made possible by 27 investment managers and the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa. So we want to dive straight in. And today's discussion, we will engage with the panelists, but we also want to engage with each and every, because this topic, it's not an academic discussion anymore. We all want an accelerated recovery. We want it to be inclusive. We want it to be sustainable as well. And not just we can write papers about this. Our livelihoods depend on this. The livelihood of my consultancy depend on this. Livelihoods of many investment companies depends on the accelerated recovery of our economy. You know, the livelihoods of the young people. We often cite the high employment rate. This is no longer a statistics anymore from all of us, essentially. We know that this impacts Brenda, who's our neighbor at the but to bring in our panelists one at a time, starting off with the CEO of the IDC, South Africa. And we all know the IDC plays an incredibly important role in our economy. They have dispersed over 120 billion rand over the years, supported over 2,100 entrepreneurs, impacting over 242 employment opportunities. So we bring in TP, who is the CEO at the IDC. And TP, if you first can just introduce yourself, a bit of background, but we have spoken a lot and many conferences open up with, just listing out all the effects of COVID-19. And many of us, know this. But what's key for us, which we'd like to hear from you, TP, is in the aftermath of COVID-19, what is the IDC's plans to catalyze and sustain the recovery of the productive sectors of our country and our continent? So TP, if you can introduce yourself and just kind of talk to us about those plans that the IDC is working on.
All right. Thank you very much, Amanda, for the invitation, and thank you to the fellow panelists and everyone else in the audience. It's indeed our honor to be invited as the IDC to this forum. As you said, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the IDC. I've worked in the area of development finance for many years, in excess of 20 years or so. I was at the Development Bank of Southern Africa, DBSA, for just over 11 years, and then I was the Chief Executive at the Land Bank for another 4 years. So it's an area that I think is fascinating and very rewarding. But to your question, efforts to accelerated economic recovery, there's no doubt that we are all in agreement about that. And in the context of South Africa, I think the president and cabinet have indeed generated like a broad policy framework or directional guidelines of where the country could focus in order to provide the kind of accelerated economic recovery that we are talking about. But from the IDC, I think I would like to make maybe 2 or 3 points. The first thing to make is that development finance institutions and banks, at the advent of COVID, we all didn't know what the future held and how things would pan out. So there was a natural adjustment to pull back and to be cautious, extra cautious, because we didn't know how things would pan out. And indeed, a lot of us experienced devaluations in our asset values. We lost capital as businesses were locked and went bankrupt. So the first thing to make is that, indeed, by God's grace, the Industrial Development Corporation has seen a significant recovery in its balance sheet quality. So assets have recovered. Our funding partners across the world, the big international development finance institutions, have opened lines of funding again to us. And indeed, we are also funded in the third instance from our matured, mainly listed assets. Those have recovered very well. And so our funding capacity is much improved, much strong at this point in time. The second thing I would like to, and therefore we have capital to deploy. That's the key point I'm making. And so the second thing that I would like to make is that, yes, in line with our mandate, indeed, our priority focus will be on those sectors that I'm sure my colleagues, the panelists, are going to talk about. In the area of industrialization or manufacturing, a lot of emphasis that we are going to place on localization of manufacturing. We are aware at a policy level where there are certain categories of products that are specifically being designated for local manufacture and local production. So a big drive is going to go there, which is also supported by the prospects arising out of the African Common Free Trade Agreement. Energy is the obvious one. We already have in excess of 13 billion rand invested in renewables. We have a robust pipeline of energy efficiency projects for distributed or self-generation. We have a lot of that, and so we will be expanding in that regard. Infrastructure is an obvious one. Again, the country has sort of lost momentum, but I think there is impetus coming back. When we engage with our colleagues in the major SOEs, I'm talking here about, for instance, Transnet, there's a whole lot of exuberance, a lot of excitement and strategic focus on driving partnerships for development in order to get infrastructure going. Thank you very much. For a start, perhaps we can talk about other sectors and so on at a later stage.
Fantastic, lovely, love those, TP, and I know that at the center of your approach is this idea of inclusive and sustainable growth. And talking about inclusivity, I want to bring Masego in. And Masego, if you start by introducing yourself. And Masego, given the context of the work you do in the social and economic justice, I imagine you wrestle with systems and structures that have made somewhat inclusivity in economies a bit of a challenge. And I'm keenly interested to hear your views, and perhaps you can paint for us this view through your point on feminist economics. So Masego, introduce yourself and talk to us about feminist economics in the context of inclusive economy.
Thank you, Manda. As you've introduced me, my name is Masego Mazongwise. I'm the CEO of the Southern Africa Trust. But I also identify as an African feminist, and I'm part of a group that penned, the call to action around the feminist economic recovery plan in the post-COVID era. And the reason why we felt that was important to put on the table is because as we think about how we rebuild economies and how we shape inclusive economic recovery plans, we really have to pay attention for whose benefit and what kind of economies are we talking about. And most importantly, what have we learned from the structures of the economy that we have known in historical terms and what they have been able to deliver for us. So I was listening quite keenly when Tsokolo was making his interventions and really intrigued by the statistics that Tsokolo was sharing around the kind of recovery that we are seeing in the development finance space. And coming from a feminist economics lens, one has to ask the question, is recovery for whose benefit? Who is driving that recovery and what kind of discussions are shaping the discourse around the priorities that we want to see set up? Sure. Now, you were asking me to bring in this notion of the feminist economics, and I think the important place to start is why that matters.
Yes, please.
Why it matters is because the feminist economics encourages us to actually start paying attention to social economics, to start paying attention to, as I said, the quality of economics, but also the spaces of economic activity that are often excluded and are regarded as social production. They're made invisible and they're not accounted for, right? So you were asking me about what kind of what do we see within the structures of the economies that we often operate in? If we come back to the context of South Africa and Africa and South Africa's role within the BRICS in being a gateway into the rest of the continent, the structure of the economy is such that it is largely informalized, and that most of the economic activity is actually driven by women being in the majority. And within that informalized structure of the economy, there are deficits that we're seeing either in terms of incentives that are being put in place, in terms of infrastructure, as well as in terms of policy support. In the business space, there are deficits that we're seeing in terms of the finance and the nature in which finance is structured to actually deliver and enable women to play a key and critical role within the economy. Yeah. Just as we were going into lockdown, most of the countries went into lockdown and we were closing down borders as a form of public health protection. And in the closure of those borders, once we started opening up, we actually forgot that 70% of the economic activity was in fact happening in informalized spaces. So we're making provisions for big business to start operating and moving their goods. But cross-border traders were left hanging dry. And smallholder farmers in rural areas were left with their access to markets being disrupted because they were completely forgotten. The other space that is important, and I'm going to wrap up here because we can come back to the other points. But the other aspect that is important here is the extent to which we have seen a reinvestment in the care economy. And this goes beyond how much we're giving to public health, but also how much we are actually paying attention to the financing and the infrastructure and the policy support and the business investment that is needed for your service industry, your domestic help, your domestic care responsibilities, early child development responsibilities, the care of the elderly, and just domestic responsibilities that many of us have had to shoulder over and above trying to play an active role within our economies. I'll pause there and we can come back to the other issues later.
Fabulous, and we are definitely coming back to these issues. I'm keenly interested to know, a view from the IDC on how we invest in this sort of social economy that you speak about. So I'll come back to TP in a moment. But I think in the same vein, we've seen that COVID-19 really has exposed a lot of these divides, the wealth inequality, the digital divides, and we can go on about these divides. And the big one, maybe for to kick off here and introduce Andy, it's around the digital device, and more so in our African continent. And somewhat that also leaves out a lot of the population out of the financial services space. And Andy will introduce himself and also talk about what him and the team are doing around digital financial inclusion, and perhaps some of the the things, the gaps that we have seen and also exacerbated by COVID-19. So Andy, we'll really love to hear some of the details at Mukuru. So take it away, introduce yourself first, and let's hear what you're doing in the space of digital financial inclusion.
Super. Thanks, Manda. Good afternoon to everybody. Wonderful to be chatting to you today. I'm Andy Jury. I'm the CEO of Mukuru. I've been there for 4 years now. The business has been in existence for 17 years. Prior to joining Mukuru, I had a very interesting but quite bumpy ride at EdCon for the better part of a decade. It was a great place to learn and hopefully been able to apply those lessons going forward. Mukuru is an African fintech. We are obsessed about building a next generation financial services platform for Africa's emerging consumer. We've served 8 million customers in our time in the last decade and a half. We have a footprint that stretches to 70 countries. And we really exist at the intersection of the informal and the formal financial services sectors, where many of our customers come to us having only transacted in a cash-intensive informal financial ecosystem and are making their first furtive steps towards something approximating formal financial inclusion. So we look to bridge the cash and digital divide. We don't see this construct of digitalization or digitization as a binary switch. We recognize that it is a series of links in a value chain that you need to ensure that you can find out where your customers are, build propositions that are relevant for them, and walk them along a solution. And so we've spent the better part of a decade and a half bootstrapping ourselves up, building technology that is fit for purpose. We embrace an African-do spirit. We are largely built by Africans for Africans. We're looking to solve solutions that, as Maseko talked about, the vast majority of financial transactions that happen in Africa happen in an informal environment. It works. It's a suboptimal solution. And really what we're trying to do is to try and find some of those pain points or points of friction, address them simply using simple but easy to access digital technology, and hopefully creating big leapfrogs forward in terms of our consumers and the broad population out there that we're trying to serve's ability to transact in a formal financial ecosystem. So this construct of financial inclusion we live and breathe on a daily basis. There's many academic papers written about it, but we are a humble set of operators, and really what we're trying to do is to just execute on that mandate. Sorry, I just got something happening with my laptop here. And so, in order for us to try and address the problems, we try to come at financial inclusion or digitization slightly differently to, I think, what perhaps alternative options are. Many people look at it and say, we exist in a formal financial services ecosystem that is digitized and it works. So it's wonderful. How do we get people to move towards us? And I think that's the wrong lens. It's too big a leap. It's assuming that we've got solutions that people need and want. We try to take a different spin on that and say, let's walk in the shoes of our potential customers. Let's understand their ecosystem. Let's understand what works, what doesn't work, where the pain points are, and then how we can bring, hopefully, very simple but robust, easy to use solutions that then we can scale to address some of these problems. And so, we have built a financial services ecosystem and a footprint that has both physical and digital payments and distribution infrastructure. And we look to apply it to use cases. And one of our primary use cases has been the construct of cross-border money transfers and sending money home. And there's a massive migrant diaspora that exists in SADC and surrounds, and really they're largely structurally underserved or not served at all by the formal financial services ecosystem. And so their only way in which, if you embark on this journey of great sacrifice in search of economic opportunity, and the primary reason why you're doing it is to send money home for your loved ones, to pay for school fees, to pay for seeds to farm with, to put food on the table. You generally, before the advent of fintech businesses like ourselves, you didn't have many options. You could go down an old-fashioned formal money transfer operator route where they charged you extortionate prices, treated you like a transaction. You had to bring a wad of documents every time you came. Or the only alternative option was to use an informal service. So if you're in Johannesburg, you go down to Park Station, you find somebody who speaks your language. Either you've had a reference from somebody in your circles of influence, so you have high trust, or you have absolutely no trust whatsoever. You haggle on price, the money disappears into a coffee tin, takes 2 weeks to get to the other side. Sometimes it doesn't get there at all. Sometimes there's a price to take it out. And so it's an ecosystem that works, but it's fraught with a lot of friction. Really what we try to do is say, what are the strong elements of that? How can we replicate those? What are the things we think we can tweak by bringing our technologically led mobile phone intensive solution to bear? And how can we create a transformative experience for our customers that they need and want, and they will then choose themselves to migrate into the solution, as opposed to having somebody try to advertise why it's cool or amazing. And so we've had great success over time, bootstrapping ourselves up just by making small incremental changes, realizing that it is a journey. If you've never touched a digital financial product before, to then send 70% of your net worth every month into the ether is something that takes a bit of time to get used to. But once you have become used to that, you can very easily see the benefits of helping yourself. And so, most of our customers come to us in a sort of analog world where they sign up meeting an agent, but they very quickly learn how to use their phone to create digital solutions for themselves that mean the money transfers instantaneously. There's a lot less opportunity cost associated with doing the primary thing that draws you to a new country, and it's been transformative. There's a lot less leakage. There's no more friction, and once you get people transacting in some way in the digital financial services ecosystem, you can then vend different products to them. You can give them a digital store of value in a wallet. You can provide them different types of insurance. You can, the world is your oyster. You're limited by your imagination. And so we're fortunate that we've been able to build strong, replicable in terms of revenue relationships with our customers over time. They've built up, a high degree of trust. And we've gone on a journey with them that, continues to expand on a daily basis. As we look to grow our services across the continent.
Fantastic. Really, really love that, and love the practicalness of your point that you bring across, and also some key lessons there around, not just throwing a solution that you have and assume that this solution will work in an informal economy, for instance, but really working in the shoes of your customers or your customers to be. And then the thing I also enjoyed was that patience, and waiting out for people to try this out, and over time, then they get to use the solution and they benefit from that. And also just leveraging technology, not the fanciest, but the technology that does the work that needs to be done. And talking about patience and some of these informal economies, I want to go back to TP, especially around the topic that Masego brought in, which is about the importance of some of the social parts of the economy that we sort of may have overlooked in the past. The care economy, even education came to the fore. Now in the aftermath of COVID-19, and all sorts of these informal economies. I'm curious, TP, how the IDC is thinking differently about investment and some of the measures, perhaps, and metrics, especially in the light of inclusivity being at the core of the investment philosophy.
Yeah.
Perhaps you can share some of the case studies, TP, and some of the organizations you may have invested in.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I just wanted to say, what Andy was saying there sounds very exciting. If you place it in the context of what the continent is trying to do, I made reference to the trade dispensation that is being driven across the continent. We need to be able to exchange value as citizens of the African continent. So I suppose, Andy, one of the challenges that are there would be, how do you take this kind of value proposition to the most remote of remotest of places in South Africa in order to build the kind of youth and gender inclusion that Masego was talking about? We know there will be a need for infrastructure finance, expanding broadband access or things like those, which is an area in which the IDC has invested substantially in telecoms or ICT infrastructure. I think, Amanda, the first thing to mention is that the IDC, amongst its sectors that we serve, has a focus on the services sector. And we are talking here about these sectors that we are talking about in terms of health, technology, education, tourism, and so on. So it is a focus area. We have a specialized unit that is dedicated to serving these sectors. And so the second point that one could make is that the IDC has a particular startup focus, almost close to venture capital type focus, where we recognize the need for early stage equity risk type capital to go into these transactions or into these projects. And we have appetite to do so. Obviously, we have to follow due process, evaluate the merits of the transactions. We are working very closely with the Department of Science and Innovation. There are very interesting things that are being explored in the area of health. Very often these innovations are not very much in our line of sight. The work that has been done by department from the policy perspective and actual research into medical equipment technologies or actual products for testing and diagnosis and treatment of disease. These are happening as we speak now at the CSIR under the auspices of the department, and we have a partnership with them. A couple of transactions that we are looking at in medical equipment, and so on. I think the fourth thing that one could mention is that there is a need to expand infrastructure, Masego, access infrastructure to less developed areas. So the IDC is a kind of organization which would finance a regional local clinic somewhere in the middle of KwaZulu-Natal for an investment of 10 million or 15 million or even less for that matter. It would invest in a regional hospital, which is probably not a high complex medical services hospital, in order to provide access, because people, yes, we understand technology these days, diagnosis can be done remotely, but in the villages, people still have to walk across to the other side of the river to visit a physical facility. So these are the kind of things that we are looking at, and indeed they're very exciting. There's more that we can talk about, indeed, to your question about building resilient communities. I mean, that's a very, very fascinating and very extremely important concept. I mean, if you think about resilience, and I mean, this is just our own proposition around it, how at an individual level, we know those who have a measure of resilience as individuals are those probably who have had access to good quality education, who are of a good state of health, and probably have a decent place to stay. So in other words, their basic primary needs are met and therefore can survive and be creative to make livelihoods for themselves. So if you think about programs for small business development, which we have, as well as other sister organizations, in order to create income generating opportunities at a decent level across all sectors of the economy, particularly in rural, township, less developed areas. Access to incomes, access to health, and the last one is access to decent living conditions. I mean, I remember when I used to work at the Land Bank, and we continue to see that large numbers of people who work in farming communities not having the most basic of living conditions. And for the children to be able to start off decently in an education process over the next 10 years of their working life, they need a decent place to go and sleep at. And so these are the kind of things that when we make investments at the IDC, we look at. Thank you very much, Amanda.
Oh, lovely. Love that. Absolutely love that. So, Maseko, I'll bring you in again because you're like my voice of inclusivity. And I want to hear, you're hearing also voices from the youth, right? We often cite this super high youth unemployment. And there's always something being said about the youth. And there was some questions that were also raised by some of the registrants when people were registering for this event. I'm keen to know, Maseko, what I know you don't want to speak on behalf of the youth, but I'm sure you're hearing voices from the youth about this area of being included in this recovery. What are the young people saying to you?
Thanks, Manda. The danger of getting on a panel like this and being the voice of inclusivity is that you just never go deep enough on any of the issues. So that's where my reluctance really comes from. And I'd wanted to spend a bit of time with Andy and Tsokolo just really talking. But going back to the feminist analysis, intersectionality is something that is important, right? Because a lot of the struggles that we're seeing around how women are made invisible and they're excluded from the economy are repeated and also reflected in the extent to which we see the space for youth. I think the first place to start for both groups, really, for both categories, is really around how we think about inclusion in terms of whether or not the groups have got a seat at the table, right? So I like that in this debate and in this discussion, there are a number of areas where there's convergence and agreement. Yeah. But where the crux lies is going to be the extent to which when we start to unpack what we are all doing collectively and we look at within the space of financial inclusion, to what extent are we catering for young people? How much of, from a user perspective and from the beneficiary perspective is in fact made up of young people? And the extent to which the products are able to deliver for, to facilitate for their economic mobility. Yeah. One of the things that really stands out is, let's talk about where young people are, or looking at the various groups where young people are. If we look at the issue around young people in rural areas, beyond financial inclusion is not going to happen if the digital and ICT penetration is leaving out the remote areas that Tsokolo has talked about. But over and above that is access to technology has to do with the affordability of that technology. So I guess that within the business space, we have to really take a holistic approach where we're looking at, if we're solving for one pain point, who do we need around the table so that we can present a holistic package that makes it possible for the marginalized, for the groups that are marginalized to be to get tangible benefits. The other thing has to do with the representation within the leadership structures, but also within the stakeholder forums, right? Yeah. So when we make a decision of infrastructure, this is the kind of infrastructure we're going to deliver. Who is shaping the priorities? Yeah. Around where what infrastructure is needed, what kind of infrastructure is needed, and where it is needed. And I think largely we have a long way to go in terms of making sure that we improve on the representation and the real tangible representation of both young people and women within the spaces. But I guess the other part of it has to do with what we count when we're talking about economic inclusion and also when we're talking about economic growth?
Yes.
Are we counting and are we paying attention to the sites where economic activities is in fact taking place? Sure. I'll go back to the space of care work. I see a very interesting comment that is coming from one of the in the audience, where they're talking about the offerings that Mukuru provides and the importance of this going beyond just remittances to looking at insurance and social protection mechanisms. It's because within the broader aspect of financial inclusion is we have to look at how do we cushion the opportunity costs that women and young people incur in their roles in terms of the social provisioning that they are playing for the rest of society to be able to draw the economic returns that we're seeing. And I don't think that we get there by having these discussions on behalf of young people, on behalf of women. We get there by making sure that we're not gender blind in our interventions, and that indeed these conversations are reflective of the kind of diversity that we want to see in that inclusive agenda.
Lovely, lovely, Masego. There was just so many nuggets there and so many questions posed to both Andy and TP. So I saw them like writing furiously. So I imagine when I go to them, they will answer some of them. So there's some questions that are coming out already from the chats, the Q&A. And I want to just kind of pick up some of those. And I want to encourage all our participants to throw as many questions as you can to our panelists. They are ready for any questions that are in their field. Andy, we seem to have quite a few for you. So one is, do you use crypto to do these transfers? Right? So that's one. And the second one from Gerald is, when should we expect Mukuru to expand product offering beyond remittances to products such as insurance and credit, as you've highlighted, in order to deepen financial inclusion? So maybe you take those two, and then I'll go to TP. There's one for TP as well. And you can also answer some of the questions from Masego.
Fantastic. Let me start and see how I can unpack those, and please keep me honest. So in terms of crypto, we have used it. It's, we definitely don't need to use it. We look at the blockchain. We try to make the process as efficient as possible. And in certain instances, in the past, it has been more efficient to use crypto as a sort of mechanism of exchange. But generally, we will either, trade foreign exchange on the open market in the way that people do, or if we have a two complementary sends in the opposite direction, we can kind of trade with ourselves. And so we will continue to look at the most efficient, cost-effective ways to get money from A to B, whether it is cross-border or domestically. There was another, I think there's a misconception that we're solely focused on international money transfers. We're very much a network that enables payments. And so we have a burgeoning domestic money transfer business in some of the countries in which we operate in. There's also large inflows into South Africa. And so it's not just about a business that serves foreigners. We are effectively trying to provide services to all Africans who need, have a need for our financial services. Africa is our focus. And we really try to bridge borders and fuel dreams. So we're looking at the opportunities where we can, bring people together as opposed to push them apart. In terms of what I would call slightly more derived financial services in terms of insurance and credit, we already offer insurance products. And so we've actually had a novel funeral insurance related product which will help people repatriate bodies in the event of their untimely death for the better part of half a decade. In all honesty, because we've been a small entrepreneurial self-funded business, we've had to focus with, I suppose, laser-like intensity to make sure that we're able to fish where the fish are and earn our right to grow. And so insurance has been one of those derived products that only in the last 2 years has really got the focus and attention that it needs. And there's a massive opportunity there that we continue to look to unpack. Credit is something that we want to be very cautious about. And so we have a credit pilot ongoing at the moment.
Excellent.
In a very safe, I suppose, sandbox where we're looking to test a range of hypotheses. Our customers, given that they are generally structurally underserved by the formal economy, won't have a lot of data that's collected about them. We are very fortunate that we have rich reservoirs of data from our 8 million customers that we've served, because they generally touch us 2 to 3 times a month. And so we've, over time, been able to build models that we think will be very good predictors of who would be appropriate candidates for value-adding credit. We certainly don't want to be in the game of providing access to consumptive credit, but for an example, if you have been a strong customer of ours for 2 years and you have a medical emergency in the middle of the month at home, which means that you need to send an extra $100 that you otherwise wouldn't have, but you've got very strong history with us, we could potentially bridge you a loan to enable that remittance to happen, such that you can address the immediate need right now when it needs to happen, as opposed to when you get paid in 2 weeks' time. Equally so, if it's planting season and you need to buy new implements and seeds, and it's a big expense now that you'll be able to amortize and pay off when the crops come in and you receive cash for it. Given that we know your cyclical behavior, we could effectively lend against that behavior. And so there's a range of things that we feel are going to be, amazing in terms of driving unlock. The construct of, loaning somebody money to own a phone is an incredibly strong and powerful unlock. And so we will generally look to provide credit lines to people who are already existing customers, as opposed to somebody we know nothing about, given that we want to use the incremental access to data we have. But it's an area of continuous research and development, and we're looking to drive those out where they're relevant and where we feel that there's an opportunity we can add value to.
Fantastic. I wonder if you want to talk to Masego about some of what you're doing around bringing solutions.
Yeah, sure. I admire the work you do, Masego. I think what we try to do is to acknowledge that there may be impediments or institutional voids in terms of the infrastructure that's been provided, the inequalities between sort of rural and urban areas and access and whatnot. We try to create a solution that can work anywhere. So if you are in the reaches of northern Natal in a dust bowl that has 1 bar of edge and you only have access to a 2G Nokia brick phone, you can use our system. You can get access to our digital wallet and you can effectively transact in the digital environment using USSD, which, it might time out. It might take a little longer than it would work on a Slick app, but it certainly works. And that same customer could transact on an iPhone 12 in a hyper-intensive fiber environment in the center of Sandton. And so we've worked exceptionally hard to try and make sure that regardless of the channel that you access on, whether it's physical, digital, whether it's on a very, very smartphone or whether it's on the sort of most basic phone, the connectivity, that none of those are barriers to entry. So we try to make that as inclusive as possible. And then we very much want to shine a light on what we believe is a disproportionately entrepreneurial, resilient spirit that we as Africans have. Where people make plans, they're able to help themselves. And so we look to empower the individual within their communities, empower the communities, and by so doing, I suppose, build that up and help people to help themselves, recognizing that we are a resilient entrepreneurial bunch, and by enabling people to move forward, we create something that we feel is sustainable from the ground up, that can then really be turbocharged as broad-based infrastructure rollouts, access to other I suppose basic elements of Maslow's hierarchy of needs come to pass. And so it's hopefully a self-sustaining mechanism.
Fantastic. Lovely. I see Masego is nodding, so we are good. TP, there's 2 questions for you on the chat. One, Tanya is keenly interested in what you mentioned about the venture capital fund. She wants to know whether this is direct investment or a fund of fund model. That's one. And then the second one maybe is from Sihle Kutlase. Interested to know what the priority is on water and wastewater, as well as what's sort of being done around improving farming in the urban areas. So it's the VC fund, what structure it is, priority on water and wastewater, and urban farming.
Yes, thank you very much. At the moment, the way we do this early stage risk capital investments, it's actually to back the entrepreneurs directly. So it is not through a fund of fund model or through a private equity or venture fund model. The IDC has been down that path of supporting funds that then deploy capital. Unfortunately, the lessons have been mixed. So we think that the best approach we should take is to try and invest side by side with the entrepreneurs, is equity finance, stay close to them, be part of the governance structure, participating perhaps in the board and providing whatever strategic support that we can offer to the business. On the area of water, if you allow me, Mandane, I want to talk about water in the broader context of infrastructure. Yeah. Because there are certain, for the economy to function, I know I'm preaching to the converted, but for the economy to function, it's like the body needs blood streams to flow throughout the body for the body to function effectively. Yeah. And that is infrastructure for you. And unfortunately, as we have seen, and we should be honest with ourselves, that the country has not invested enough in bulk water systems, one. Two, unfortunately, the country has not invested enough in the upgrade of reticulation systems at local government level. It's there, all the studies are there, we have a problem. Let me make an example. I always mention this because I'm a proud boy from the Free State. I come from the Eastern Free State. Yeah. There's a town called Harrismith on your way to Durban along the N3. One of the biggest problems in that area, high potential zone, yeah, has been designated as a potential industrial development zone, yeah, but the municipality there is struggling to provide the most basic of services like water. And as a result, you then have challenges when you want to promote industrial development and the establishment of new manufacturing enterprises there. But pleased to say that these issues are being responded to. I was having a discussion on Monday with Lionel October, the Director General, who has just left the DTIC, and he has been mandated to drive this special economic zones industrial development program. And one of the key things that he's focusing on is not about building the factory only. It's about unlocking the infrastructure that is required in order to enable the factory to operate. So to that point. So, and then with regards to agriculture, and I understand the angle that the person who asked the question is urban agriculture. Yes, we haven't made enough strides. Even we as the IDC are not there in terms of promoting agriculture around the urban edge, around urban periphery. And it is an area of great potential because we know that there is advanced agricultural methods where you can farm on smaller pieces of land. So South Africa is still like many other African countries at the moment. A farmer must own vast hectareage of land in order to be able to produce. Whereas there are many countries of the world, around the world, Netherlands is one of them, yeah, very competitive in terms of producing basic food and export into the rest of the European zone. With the limited land that they have, you know, the Netherlands, they keep recovering the sea, land from the sea in order to provide adequate land for themselves. So yeah, yes, I take the challenge around urban agriculture. We are still too much a own 1,000 hectare of land type thinkers in our economic construct of agriculture. So happy to take that particular challenge. I just wanted to say to my colleague Maseko that what we are trying to do at the IDC, and I know it's not enough, is to do a set aside. So in other words, of the annual capital allocation that we say we want to invest in the economy, we deliberately say X amount, and this is in our corporate plans, which are public documents. X amount of money has to go to women-owned businesses. X amount of money has to go to youth-owned businesses. X amount of money has to go to Black businesses, because we have a transformation agenda to cope with and to run. But what we do know is that there is then a need for business development services. You know, when a young person wants to start a business, you want them to be creative. People should not think about a spaza shop as the obvious business to start. But when they have, I met a young fellow who has started a clothing label, a shoes label, is expanding the business now. And so these are the kind of things that we should encourage. And at the IDC, we do have a team that specializes in providing business development services. So that place of researching your concept, preparing your business plan, developing the financial model that you can then take to a bank or to another development finance institution for funding, because funders will always want to back a concept and the entrepreneur who's driving the concept. So these are some of the interventions that I think we can bring to bear. The ecosystem has to be strengthened by having as many other institutions as possible participating in providing these kind of services. Thanks, Manda.
TP, Maseko is nodding, and that's a good sign. So Maseko, you do work in the policy space. I wonder what policy changes should we be considering as a country to ensure a resilient recovery?
Yeah. I think that's a good question, and absolutely, I'm nodding because we are in agreement in a lot of areas, and nodding in excitement because I also think that beyond the webinars, there is space for us to work closely together in how we monitor and also just how we cross-fertilize ideas around how we rethink some of the models that we have, the systems we have, what we have learned previously. To your question about the policy shifts that we need to see, I want to tie it together with the question that Tsepo Modise is asking. And he or she is asking the question, what are the 3 critical sectors that we need to invest in order to see economic recovery, true and inclusive economic recovery? I'll go back to talking about the need to reinvest in the care economy, right? And I'm glad that you asked the question about the policy interventions, because so far we haven't talked about the role of the state, the role that the state plays, one in setting norms, but also setting the policies and also putting in place the incentives that make it possible for transformation to take place. Within the care economy, I think the one thing that is really urgent and needs to be looked at urgently is the question of social protection. And also the question of the budgetary allocations that are provided to the public services that we talked about. Sokola talked about education, health services, the infrastructure that is needed. But we have to look at the kinds of social infrastructure that unlocks economic opportunities for populations that are so far on the margins of the economy. So that's the first place to start. The second place to start is that around building food sovereignty. And I like the question that was asked that was highlighting the plight around urban agriculture. A month into lockdown, this very region, I think more than 45%, okay, let me not go into the statistics because I might get it wrong, but a large population of people a month into lockdown were faced with hunger.
Sure.
And that hunger was not about shortage of food. It had to do with distribution. It also had to do with farmers' produce getting to the market, but it also had to do with exposing the extent to which over the years we have overinvested in agricultural production for export and not agricultural production for the purposes of feeding our populations and making it possible for people to have access to food, right? So I think there's a need to rethink our agricultural policies and also look at the kinds of incentives that are available there. What incentives are available for the smallholder farmer, taking into account that 70% of labor within the agricultural sector is provided by women. So when we then look at the policy side, is the question around women's access to productive assets and the ambit of the policy framework that makes it possible there. Access to finance and so forth, and access to markets. That will be the second sector that I think that is important. The third part is around this notion of expanding our understanding of the plurality of the economy and economic models.
Sure.
We go back to what the ILO said about the structure of our economies in Africa, 70% of whom are being informalized. And I love it that businesses like Mukuru see that as an opportunity, and they design products to tap into that market. But to what extent are the financing structures and the policies within our space able to actually support cooperative business models? And when we talk about the individual entrepreneur, that entrepreneur also bearing the face of an informal cross-border trader in our ambit, of a migrant worker, of a woman who might be in an informal settlement, and so forth and so forth. So from the policy side is we need policies that actually in very tangible ways make it possible for the small and medium enterprises to operate and for them to be able to migrate out of that a cluster of businesses into bigger and medium enterprises that are able to tap into the more formalized structures of our funding mechanisms. I'll pause here.
Thanks a lot. So I know that TP has got a time constraint. TP, your thoughts in the discussion that Masego is leading here, and then maybe your concluding thoughts, because you have a time constraint and we only have minutes of your time.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your consideration. There's maybe I'll close off by sort of responding to certain specific questions that I saw in the chat room. The one talks about how funding from the BRICS funds. I think the term BRICS funds is used. Yeah. Just to say that for instance, one of the institutions in that configuration is the new development bank, which was called the BRICS Bank when it started. It's alive and it's operating and it's investing money in all the economics of the BRICS countries. However, the way it works as a wholesale bank. So it provides bulk facilities to the likes of IDC or DBSA or any other institutions that they can work with, and then that institution then intermediates the funding. I can tell you now, we have concluded a large funding line with the BRICS Bank, but it is particularly or specifically aimed at promoting the energy sector in South Africa, because we really want to expand opportunities of financing into the energy sector. The second thing that I would like to mention is in the form of a question, a person asking about bridging access to information. Yeah, in fact, we were just having a discussion on Friday last week with our colleagues from the African Development Bank. And we have decided to join hands, and the project is in a very well advanced stage of creating a platform, really, and a digital technology platform, which can be accessed very easily using all sorts of technologies like phones and everything by anybody, anywhere, which would provide access to the products and services that are offered by institutions such as ourselves, including access points, who to contact, what downloading information material, being able to execute an application, where can you access business development services in order to frame your business plan. So at the moment, that's what we're working towards. But at this point in time, I think the best case scenario is going through the websites of the individual institutions such as the IDC, you know. So on. And then lastly, I just want to say, indeed, you know, we cannot forget the African continent in terms of its development and integration, colleagues. South Africa, give and take, how many people? 58 or 60 million? It's too small a market to really drive substantial expansion in business opportunities. So that vision, which was set a long time ago, when the NEPAD initiative was set up, President Beki at the time, President Obasanjo, about the whole of the African continent growing at the same time, you know, a tide rising and lifting all the boats is how we should think about the African continent in terms of market opportunity, but also growing together. Huge infrastructure opportunities. South African companies, if they play their cards well, the partnership opportunities that prevail. So in other words, state institutions, but also private sector institutions in various countries looking for partnerships with maybe South African companies that already have well-established models in order to expand their footprints. So Manda and fellow panelists and those who are in attendance, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to make a small contribution. I will please excuse myself at this point in time. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Fantastic. Thanks a million, TP, for your insights and the work that you're doing with the IDC. And it sounds like there's a further work that will be done with the panelists. So, yes. So that's exciting for us.
Wonderful.
Excellent. So thank you, TP. There's a question directed to you, Andy, which is, what's your view on the regulatory environment in respect to its ability to progress digital financial inclusion in the country?
It's a really multifaceted question. I think you've got a range of overlays. Generally, the regulator we work with most closely in South Africa is the Reserve Bank. And there are, I suppose, some telecom regulations that come into play. But we, in our history, have found the Reserve Bank as an entity to be quite progressive. It's made big, substantive changes to know your customer regulations, the way in which you can participate in the financial services ecosystem, certainly in the last decade, without, in our minds, and hopefully theirs, eroding the efficacy of the regulations that are in place to ensure that we can safeguard against the financial crimes that they're looking to moderate against. And so there is this construct of introducing a risk-based approach in terms of how you do business with your potential customers, which is, a best of breed in the rest of the world. I think there are, we do have some legacy rules around the classification of when people can send money to individuals as individuals and when they can or can't send as businesses and stuff that I think just is an extra set of letterboxes we don't need. And so hopefully we can continue to progress in terms of simplifying things. But in our experience, at least, regulatory constructs, oversight hurdles, etc., are not really a barrier to good ideas from well-minded people who want to do business. I think the thing we find as an impediment to businesses growing and flourishing, particularly in Southern Africa, is access to capital that is needed as an important point where you've proved you've got a good idea, but you don't necessarily have the cash flow to fund it. I've been fortunate to work in other parts of the world, and you can get, $1 million, $10 million in the US to fund a half good idea, let alone a good one. And so we've got to reprogram our mindset in terms of being happy to try a couple of things and be prepared to fail, knowing that the solution lies within, as opposed to us having solutions foisted on us from the rest of the world. And so you can say what you want to, but seed capital, angel capital, venture capital, growth, private equity, grant funding isn't anywhere near as lubricated as it could be. And there is a plethora of great ideas that we should be, seeing how we can seed and fund, knowing that maybe 50% of them are going to fail, but the 50% that work are going to, pay off handsomely and create great advancements to society.
Fantastic. Love that advancement in society as a result. So, Maseko, just back to you. there's a constant push towards more and more technology, and there's a good that comes with that. And I just wonder what sort of guardrails should we be thinking about to make sure that there's inclusivity and sustainability in some of these advances in technology.
Thanks, Manda. I think there is some really exciting developments that are happening in technology, and we see African-based technologies playing an exciting disruptive role. But when we then come back to the question that you're asking around the kinds of investments that we need to make so that there's a lot more inclusivity, I think the first place to start is that around education. And there has been a lot of discussions on education and the space of STEM within our education system, but also within that, for us not to take a gender blind approach into understanding that. There are some exciting programs that are happening that are around attracting the girl child and young people into the tech space, the girls who code, the schooling and education systems courting girls to be interested in robotics and so forth. Because what we know and what we have seen, I think there's been a lot of attention on the kind of inherent social biases that are built into technology development if we don't pay attention to who is playing the role in that. The other thing, it goes back to what I said earlier about paying attention to the drivers of the growing digital divide and the drivers behind the gender gap that we see in the technology uptake.
Yeah.
So it would be really interesting for us to interrogate the data and look at to what extent is a lot of what is available are women taking up, and what barriers are they facing, and how do we go about addressing those? In a number of conversations we've had with women who are involved as cross-border traders and women who are involved as smallholder farmers, one of the barriers has to do with affordability. Yeah. It has to do with data costs. Particularly in South Africa, the cost of data is way too high. So you can't take advantage of the opportunities that technology presents if the costs already present a barrier. The last thing has to do with transaction costs.
Yeah.
And I'll give a very practical example. Andy might be familiar with this, but one of the most exciting projects we worked on during the COVID pandemic, last year, together with Finmark Trust, was we approached one of our development aid donors and asked them, because most of the governments were putting in place economic recovery packages, but these economic recovery packages were leaving out migrants. They're leaving out domestic workers. They were leaving out informal traders, particularly the cross-border traders. And in our discussions with UK Aid, we said to them, we know the role that remittances plays in the livelihoods of many families. But at this point in time, where people have lost their sources of income, they have less money to send home. How do we bridge the gap between the costs that they must pay in fees of their remittances and how much their family members receive? And we were able to get grants where we could offset those fees on behalf of the groups that were already in the database of many of the service providers that were facilitating remittances. But that's a stopgap measure. In the long term, how do we re-look at this? And in that ambit of financial inclusion, without necessarily saying it is the burden of the private sector to come up with the solutions, is to go back to what I was saying earlier. What is the role of the state?
Sure.
What is the role of the state in facilitating an economy that delivers for the well-being of all? What is the role of the state in terms of regulating the market? What is the role of the state in terms of putting in robust social protection mechanisms that in fact cover for some of the opportunity costs that we're seeing a lot of people who are on the margins of the economy having to absorb? So I think there's multiple stakeholders that need to really think about what this idea of an inclusive economy looks like and how we need to rethink it. The last point, did I say the last point with the last one?
No, it wasn't.
I might have said the last point, but I think that one thing that is really important is, in all honesty, in these conversations around post-COVID recovery and inclusive economies, are we truly thinking about what an alternative to a neoliberal economic system might look like? Some of us were we're quite excited about the possibility of a formulation of BRICS as an alternative that might actually position a different kind of economy that might deliver for the global south, which is different from what we have seen in over 75 years. So I think in that rethinking, we really have to go back to the kinds of what is the economic system that we want to talk about? And I don't think that we are getting there. I think we're just really talking about tweaking the status quo as it stands. And I don't think it's going to deliver inclusivity in the way that we need to see it.
Fabulous. That was that the last point, Maseko? I wanted to just check in. Thank you for that. Those were beautiful. So Andy, one of the semi-last point was about, and there was a case study on reducing the cost of transactions. So I see GT here is also asking specifically to you, Andy, is there scope for reducing the cost of using Mukuru services to preserve value for the users?
Yeah, wholeheartedly. I think there are a number of factors at play, though. Because we largely exist in a cash-to-cash offline world where we bridge into the digital worlds, there are a lot of costs associated with facilitating that. You need a physical infrastructure. You need people who are working there. You have partners that you partner with who clip the ticket every time it comes through. There's actually the physical movement of cash that needs to happen. If you really want to deliver a service, you've got to guarantee that when somebody arrives on the other side to collect money, that there is going to be a supply of cash. And so that is the sort of most expensive cost bar of any kind of financial services transactional delivery. And so as things digitize, as access and greater degrees of financial inclusion happen, then naturally the more you digitize things, the fewer links in the value chain, the fewer, I suppose, partners or handoffs you have, the cheaper it becomes, and that gets passed on to the customer. And so it's really a case about making sure that structurally we can invest to ensure it's sustainable. I could drop prices to 0 tomorrow or 1% or whatever. We wouldn't exist in a month's time. And so the opportunity cost of it continues to be a balancing act. And thankfully, in an open market like ours, there are competitive forces, a plethora of choice, and customers will ultimately benefit over time if we continue to invest in making sure that we can address some of the headwinds we have in terms of these structural changes and turn them into tailwinds. We were fortunate that businesses like ours that are platform businesses actually benefited from COVID being a structural tailwind because it forced people to think differently, increase the number of people that were using our services, and you're then able to amortize and spread costs over time. But banging a drum and saying that remittance prices or transactional costs must be X without actually addressing the impediments or factors that potentially prevent the market from offering it there on a sustainable basis, don't really get to the root of why we are. And as I mentioned earlier on, many people existing in the informal economy are kind of in a suboptimal structural equilibrium because that's the way that life has happened over time. And until we can bridge that divide and move the broad reach of the economy forward, we've still got some work to do on that.
Excellent. So I'll just get volunteers between the two of you here. Terence wants the panelists to weigh in on sustainability, and I'm not sure. Masego is nodding. She sounds like she wants to go first. I don't know if you want to weigh in on the sustainability part of this post-COVID-19 recovery discussion.
I was nodding not because I wanted to go first, but because I thought it was a great question. No, I think absolutely. You see, so for me, again, I keep going back to the lessons that the COVID pandemic has demonstrated for us. I see the COVID pandemic and the climate crisis as an example, as two sides of the same coin. And these two sides of the same coin are signs of the common denominator there is an economic system and a model that is not good for business, not good for humanity, not good for our ecological integrity. Right. Mm-hmm. So in one space of human history, we are dealing with two major crises that are saying pause a bit. This issue around sustainability, particularly ecological sustainability or environmental sustainability, is not an add-on, but has to be part and parcel of how we think about businesses and how we think about economies. And I think that when it comes to corporates, I know that there's a lot of, when people actually report on their sustainability indicators, those indicators are often glowing. But when you then go on the ground and you look at the reality and the lived experiences with, for people who live in those spaces, the indicators are not as glowing as they are. Yes. And for me, it goes back to who gets to monitor and who is actually tracking the ecological footprint of any business activity. And it goes back again to what I was saying about the role of the state in terms of enforcing environmental regulations and so forth. Tokolo spoke earlier about, he gave some really interesting statistics on what the IDC was doing around investments in the renewable energies. Yeah. And I think we need to see more and more of increases in the investments in renewable energies, but also more and more in terms of access and benefit sharing for populations that are in our countries and populations that are in our continent. The other space that I think there is already a ready ground for us to think about sustainability is in the space of food security and food sovereignty. And it goes back to the investments that we're making in agriculture. What kind of agriculture are we investing in? Is it agriculture that protects the ecological integrity of the land that we are farming, that is protecting the water bodies, or it's agriculture that is pumping in chemicals that are destroying the very water bodies that are important for for driving our economies, be it from electricity provision, irrigation, the water that you and I drink on a daily basis, and so forth. So sustainability is really important here. But I lastly is the question of social sustainability.
Good.
And that question of social sustainability is how we think about building social resilience. Business models that deliver inequality and huge wealth gaps are not good for business.
Sure.
And COVID showed us that. It actually demonstrated to us that when the social systems are so vulnerable, it is easy for a pandemic like COVID to get hold of the entire world and to bring the world to a standstill. And when that happens, nobody's safe. Nobody's safe until we're all safe. Yeah. So the social infrastructure that we're talking about within our ecosystems It's not a nice to have. These are fundamentals. If we're going to be building social sustainability and if we're going to be building resilient economies.
Fantastic. Andy, do you want to weigh in?
Can I chip in? I think this is something we obsess about on a daily basis. The simplest way to sustain something is to grow it, and it's very, very difficult to sustain if you are going backwards very quickly and reverse. But the growth that we focus on is inclusive growth, not extractive growth. And I think Maseko was talking about instances where we have one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. We have mass inequality, and we do, whether we like it or not, live in an extractive society that is relatively self-sustaining, generally, I suppose, because it might benefit us as self-serving individuals. And so we need to change the mindset. We believe that it starts with education. You cannot get anywhere until you can invest in the youth of today, particularly primary, base level education, and help a nation to help itself. And so that's a key element of the things that we focus on in terms of growing our businesses, making sure that you have appropriate role models that can then harvest that cycle of reinvestment. But our focus is, how do we make things more efficient? How do you reduce the opportunity cost, the waste, the friction, etc.? And so our services, in some small way, hopefully, improve the lives of our customers that use it. They have a transformative experience. It frees up time, energy, and capital to apply to other things, either building other businesses, sending more money home, reserving more money for themselves, uplifting their level of the way in which they live their lives. And so if we can focus our attention on driving inclusive growth opportunities, and try and in some way make sure that we are looking to change the dynamic in terms of extractive growth versus inclusive growth, then hopefully with small but incremental changes, we then build up some momentum and then it becomes self-sustaining.
Excellent. So just to follow up here, Andy, some business people might say, these models that drive inclusivity, I think there was even a phrase, fortunes at the bottom of the pyramid. How profitable will they be? Is this a place where money goes and it comes back in cents? Maybe from your experience.
Look, as I mentioned earlier, we bootstrapped ourselves up. And so we've been fortunate that we've been able to make a profit on day one. We've had to make a profit on day one because that has bought us the right to grow. And we provide a service that has low barriers to entry. Anybody could essentially do it. And so if we provide a poor service or the wrong service at the wrong price, etc., then our customers vote with their feet. And so it's a delicate balancing act. But we see immense opportunity in terms of serving the biggest part of the total addressable market. So there are 1 billion people in Africa. 80% of them exist in the ecosystem in which we operate at the bottom of the pyramid. It's about making sure that you can build sustainable, inclusive opportunities that people choose to use, as opposed to having forced down their throats. And then it does, it grows them as mushrooms. And once you teach a man to fish, you feed him for life. And so we look to walk a path of, forward momentum and opportunity with our customers, where if you can address their needs at where they are at a point in time, reduce the friction, reduce the wastage, that enables them to invest in their own growth journey, and we grow with them. And so we have seen immense opportunity. We see, the opportunity continuing to be ripe across our continent, and there are many people in the rest of the world who seem to see that, and there's a lot of businesses that are pouring in to the rest of Africa, trying to exist in this space that do similar and very different things. And so we see it as an opportunity that where others see calamity or the institutional voids or the holes in the ecosystem, we see that as an opportunity to bridge with the simple application of the technology that we provide.
Fantastic. So I'm keen to just hear your concluding thoughts around how you might even be summarizing some of the key points you brought. We got 5 minutes. Just your concluding remarks around how we truly build economies that are more inclusive, especially in the era of 4IR, economies that are resilient, and the tech is advancing. How should we be thinking about our economies in a way that will be resilient, sustainable, and inclusive. Just concluding thoughts, especially in the context of the 4IR. Shall I start with you, Andy, because your name starts with an A?
I'm going to go first. We are simple operators at Mukuru, and we also try to be rational human beings. There's a massive part of our society that is largely been structurally excluded from the formal ecosystem that many of us on this call today operate in, and that creates a burning platform. And what we see is an opportunity to address some of those challenges, to ensure that we can enable vast sections of society to move forward, and at the same time provide service to them that they perceive as value, which generates value for ourselves. And so we see that as a self-sustaining, harmonious ecosystem. It's a massive opportunity that we've only really scratched the surface on. It is one that TP talked about, looking at Africa as a broad addressable market, that we continue to see very similar opportunities beyond our borders. And we as a nation of 60 million people, we don't have a big enough homogenous demand pool to drive big leaps forward. And so we want to see how we can harvest opportunities that exist in other very similar territories, undergoing, I suppose, similar changes and metamorphoses over time. But whilst it has been an exceptionally tumultuous both personal and professional journey over the last 12 months, and for many individuals, COVID has wreaked havoc unforeseen, certainly in our lifetimes and generations. We have tried to look for the elements of opportunity that these dislocations have brought, and see how we can rapidly apply the technology that we've built. And we try to take an approach of trying many small things, making sure that there's a feedback loop, and ensuring that we learn even if we fail. We place bets in small Lego blocks, and we've been fortunate that we built our own African homegrown, hopefully world-class tech system that we can apply in a modular fashion to a range of challenges that society faces today. So where others see chaos, we see immense opportunity and continue to see an incredible growth path that we can contribute to build the momentum I was talking about, which will ultimately create the self-sustaining society we want.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thanks for the work that you're doing in our continent and beyond. And we're looking forward to more and more amazing solutions that add value to all of us. So Masego, your concluding remarks.
Yeah. So my concluding remarks would be to say we realize this by making sure that nobody's left behind, right? And this is really the idea of putting people back at the center of the economy and what it is and who it delivers for. And I think that corporates and the business community can play an active role in terms of being progressive norm setters. And again, going back to really about who BRICS is and what is BRICS and what kind of reality does BRICS deliver for its people, and how is it different from the status quo that landed us in the mess that we're in. The second thing is to perhaps I'll borrow from feminist sisters in Hawaii who put together the feminist post-COVID recovery plan. And they take us back to basics, to understanding, going back to the Greek meaning of the economy. And that Greek meaning of the economy being to manage the household, and understanding that the economic actors at the household level are diverse. And therefore, when we look at what the economy delivers, it ought to deliver shared value for everyone, for everyone. Yeah. And coming back to where I started, where I was talking about the role of women within the economy, I think there's some fundamentals that are important here, is that women are not a target for business. Sure. We have to shift our notion around the role that women play and understand that they are not a target group that has to be given special means through which they climb up a ladder of the status quo and this economic system that we have now, and recognize as well as support, provide them enabling frameworks that allow them to grow as economic actors, but also one that recognizes them as political agents for change. So more of these conversations, I'd like to see more women on the panel. contributing to that.
Excellent. Love that. So I don't know if you can unmute wherever you are, and let's just give a massive round of applause to our panelists, Masego, Andy, TP. I think these were absolutely amazing. You know, I'll be. I think I'll need to go listen to this recording again just to really draw on those insights that all of you were able to share. I don't know if we're able to all unmute and just kind of really just say thank you so much, and very, very well done.
Thank you.
Thank you for your insights and for sharing so generously, even the nitty-gritties of your business model and what you're busy with on a day-to-day. So that will be it for now. That was your first session of this BRICS Business Council round table. And next up is the second session talking about BRICS ESG indices, a sense for the future of emerging market investing. So that will be on the 13th of May, same time from 2 p.m. South African time to 15:30. And there's a fabulous panel, as you can see there on the screen. So looking forward to seeing you there. Once again, these sessions are made possible by 274 and the IDC and the partners that you will have seen listed on the website. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you for the next session. And thanks once again to the panelists. Have a fabulous day ahead.